You didn't ask for them, but I'm giving them to you anyway. Here's my top 5 moments in Egg Bowl history.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, I'm Stephen Willis, a 10-year veteran of Yahoo Sports and the national media, and thank you very much for joining me. And thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available in all the podcast apps and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to do the top 5 moments in Egg Bowl history. This is the way this goes. I asked my guests over the course of the week to give theirs, and we count those down from 5 until 1. But I do it a little bit differently. I start with number 1 and I work to 5. Tonight, we're going to go over the top 5 Egg Bowl moments, and we're going to start with the greatest of the great. It's the Immaculate Deflection at number 1. It's a situation. This was the second football game from Ole Miss or anybody else that I had ever went to. I was there with my father. It was a weird day. Storms were obviously coming in. We were worried about getting rained on our walk back to the VA on Woodrow Wilson after the ball game, because that's where he parked, and we just walked on down. This was a game that had some moments. Mississippi State got up to a 23-7-ish lead. I forget, it's been 50 years. But you sit there and Ole Miss started chipping away. Kelly Powell scored a touchdown off of a fumble. And then all of a sudden, a weird Timmy Moffitt touchdown on a punt return where Ole Miss blocked nobody. Go back there and look for that. Ole Miss sent 10 to block the punt. The punter got the punt off, no problem. So all the players were down the field, and it was up to Timmy Moffitt to make that play. He ended up running it back for a touchdown. Ole Miss would go ahead. They would go down the field. Mississippi State would drive down. It was a 27-yard field goal. Billy Brewer called a timeout to famously ice the kicker, wait for a breeze to come in, all of this stuff that he really couldn't have done. He just got incredibly lucky by this sequence of events. Artie Cosby was a good kicker. The number 2 in the picture right there. He was a good kicker. He was an all-SEC level guy. So whenever he was lining up for a 27-yard field goal, everybody assumed the game was over. And when he kicked the ball, the Mississippi State fans stood up and started cheering because it was going right down the middle. And then as the wind hit it and pushed it back down, they sat down. The Ole Miss people stood up, started cheering. The Ole Miss bench went absolutely nuts. My father picked me up when I was 7 years old, threw me up in the air. I ended up landing on his shoulder somehow in the bleachers. Either way, this was the game that cemented my fanhood in Ole Miss football, because honestly, I peaked at this point. My football life peaked right here. The Immaculate Deflection is number 2. Number 2, I put the piss and the miss on the list. Elijah Moore hiking his leg in 2019 that ended up costing Matt Luke his job, that led to Lane Kiffin being hired and led directly to Ole Miss being in the playoff discussion, the Heisman discussion, on the top 10 positional list, all come from this moment. Now, when it happened, Ole Miss fans were pretty devastated that something like that selfish act would put a field goal kicker that has consistently struggled into a longer kick. He ended up missing that as well. Mississippi State won the game. Ole Miss fired Matt Luke about 3 or 4 days later. And then all of a sudden the race was on to try and hire Lane Kiffin away from Arkansas. This also famously cost Joe Moorhead his job, the Mississippi State coach, who at that point was 2-0 against Ole Miss, because the rivalry in their eyes, because everybody wants to play this and to where the other one is a little brother, the rivalry just wasn't important and his results weren't good enough. So they fired Joe Moorhead and brought in Mike Leach, God rest his soul. But the rest is history of what's going on, and these programs have separated over the last 5 years, and it's going to culminate potentially with a Ole Miss 2024 playoff run. So thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. When we come back, we are going to talk about the next 3 and potentially some honorable mentions at the end on this, top 5 list edition of the Locked On Ole Miss podcast. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, you can bet on Ole Miss on the win total for the 2024 season that currently sits at 9.5 is the over-under. You can get that at minus 144, or you can actually just bet on Ole Miss to win the SEC, which is currently at 650, plus 650, the third best odds in the SEC at the moment, if that is your flavor of choice. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, it's America's #1 sportsbook. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all that screaming and shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every single day. All right, we're going to continue our top 5 countdown of top 5 Egg Bowl moments. And now it gets interesting, and it's stuff that I remember from my lifetime. And the 90s play a little bit of a role of what's coming on. But number 3 on the list, it is the 2-point conversion in 1997. Ole Miss won that game 15-14. Ole Miss ended up going back to a bowl game. They went to the Motor City Bowl to face Randy Moss and Marshall. It was a situation where Ole Miss scored a touchdown on the first drive of the game, and then they scored a touchdown and went for 2 on the last drive of the game, but didn't do much else in the time in between. It's an interesting situation. I've talked to John Avery about this. I've talked to Stuart Patridge. I've talked to Walker Jones, who I don't think he was on this team, but he was obviously an Ole Miss fan in this. But those Tommy Tuberville teams, those were kind of my wheelhouse in growing up. This 97 game, I would have been 20, 21 years old, somewhere around there, about going to Ole Miss age. And, you know, you have a situation to where this is just a good team, and this was kind of announcing your return onto the scene. Ole Miss won this game 15-14, but it was the same year that they beat LSU, who was ranked in the top 10 in the country in Baton Rouge. This was a good 97 Ole Miss football team. They went 7-4. They were not going to go to a bowl game at 6-5. And there just wasn't as many bowl games. But this was a extremely gutsy play call, and it will go down in the annals of Ole Miss history. Number 4, the stand. Everybody remembers the stand. The big play that everybody remembers, I think his name was Chad Brown at defensive tackle, making the hit on the Mississippi State running back. Mississippi State had 12 plays from inside the 10-yard line to score a touchdown and could not do it. The 92 Ole Miss defense, potentially one of the better ones that they have had. 93 ended up being number 1 in the country, but those Joe Lee Dunn type defenses, they were very hard to deal with. Remember, Joe Lee Dunn basically is the godfather of the 3-3 stack defense. He did it at Ole Miss. He did it at Mississippi State. He passed it on to his tree that made it all the way out to San Diego State, where a young linebackers coach at that point picked it up named Zach Arnett. So he is in that Joe Lee Dunn tree as well. But this was a big deal. Greg Plump was at quarterback for Mississippi State. He threw an incomplete pass on the end. He threw an interception. It was just a weird series of events that consistently Ole Miss was putting itself in a very difficult situation, but the defense completely stood up. Corey Philpott, one of my favorite Ole Miss running backs of all time. And when I do an Ole Miss running back top 5, which I'm going to do, Corey Philpott's going to sit on that list. Fumbled the ball. You have a situation where Mississippi State just kept getting the ball back, and time after time after time they had a chance. Ole Miss ended up winning the game, I think 17-10 or something like that, maybe 17. Yeah, 17-10. Really interesting stuff. And last on our list, nobody in my talks this week has brought up this, and it was the winning go-ahead drive at the end of the game by John Fourcade in 1981 to defeat Mississippi State. This was the year before my first Ole Miss game. The last play of John Forcade's Ole Miss career was a touchdown to defeat Mississippi State, where he ran the ball around the end, kind of like early option, out of the, not in the wishbone, but it looked like a quarterback just running around the end. John Forcade was on my show. He talked about that play, and he's like, hey, if the defensive end would just hit me, there was no way I was scoring. But he, for some reason, went out to the running back, left the opening up, and I just turned the corner and went into the end zone. John Forcade was really cool about that. Him and his brother Keith, he said, I believe, were the only two players that have scored a touchdown on their final Ole Miss play. I don't know if that is actually true, but I will take his word for it. I know John Forcade did it, but Keith Forcade was at my first game. It was in 1982. This was a big win. This was probably the seminal win of the Steve Sloan era. Everything that you would hope for was brought forth whenever Ole Miss won that game, and there was hope for 1982 going in that. Even though John Forcade graduated, you had a young quarterback named Ken Austin coming into the system. There was some hope that Ole Miss was going to be able to take this drive and kind of propel it forward. But there was all kinds of problems defensively on those Ole Miss teams, and it led to Billy Brewer being hired before the 1983 season, which actually led to the Immaculate Deflection. So if you look at our top five, we have the Immaculate Deflection in 1983. We have a whole bunch of stuff. The Piss and the Miss from 2019 at number 2. Number 3 is the 2-point conversion in 1997. Number 4 is the stand. And number 5 is John Forcade's final drive. Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We got a lot of transfer portal stuff that is starting to percolate. We'll keep an eye on that. We'll continue our off-season talking season type shows as well. Hope everybody has a good time. We will talk to you tomorrow. Hotty toddy, everyone.